Introduction to the Bible, Session 3. This session will cover the early part of the Pentateuch, creation and fall. Background of the Pentateuch. The name Pentateuch describes the first 5 books of the Old Testament. In the Hebrew, this is known as the Torah, which is translated as instruction or sometimes as law. The Pentateuch name means 5 scrolls in English. It covers the books from Genesis to Deuteronomy. Sometimes the word hexateuch, or 6 books, is used for the books Genesis all the way to Joshua. Joshua completes the story with the conquest of the Promised Land. The dates. These books cover 600 years, roughly 1900 to 1250 BC, from Abraham to Moses. The literary style. These books have many different types of literature within them, including epic, hero stories, narrative, poetry, and law. But it's all put together into one large story. The focus of this story is the origins and birth of the nation Israel. The major themes of this big story of the Pentateuch is found in a short passage in Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 5 through 10. As I read this story, listen to the main parts of it. Then you shall declare before the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down into Egypt with a few people and lived there and became a great nation, a powerful and numerous. So first of all, the wandering Aramean there was Abraham. He went down into Egypt with a few people. That would be Joseph, and then his brothers who joined him. Verse 6, but the Egyptians mistreated us and made us suffer, subjecting us to harsh labor. That is when the people of Israel became slaves to the Egyptians. Then we cried out to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our misery, toil, and oppression. This refers to the exodus from Egyptian slavery. So the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great terror and with signs and wonders. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. That describes the period of the conquest that would soon take place under the leadership of Joshua. These are the major themes of this story. We have promise made to Abraham, election, a special people are chosen, deliverance from slavery, covenant, the establishment of relationship, law, how the people should live, and land, where they should live, the promise that God gave to Abraham. These books are history with a purpose. There's a 2-part theological division to the Pentateuch. The first 11 chapters give the prologue and give the problem. Genesis 12 through the end of Deuteronomy give the birth of a nation. They give the solution to the problem, although this solution is incomplete. Authorship of the Pentateuch. These books are grouped together as one whole, both in the ancient Hebrew and also in modern Bible scholarship. These books claim no authorship, but traditionally it has been attributed to Moses. Form critics of the 19th century developed what is called the documentary hypothesis. They noticed as they studied these books in great detail in the original language that different names are used for God in different parts of these 5 books. This especially developed among scholars in Germany during the early 19th century, became known as form criticism. They determined, as the theory goes, 4 different parts, or 4 different possible authors or sources used in the Pentateuch. And this is known as JEDP. The J stands for the German Yahweh, because the Germans were the ones who came up with this. and it covers certain portions, as you can see in the notes, and certain period of time. This part of the Pentateuch uses the divine name Yahweh, and it emphasizes God's purpose and nearness. Scholars also noticed that there are certain parts of the Pentateuch that use the divine name Elohim, and so this is known as the Elohist. And they conjecture, they theorize, that this comes from the northern part of Israel. It notes God's transcendence and fear of God. The covenant is at the center of the theology of history. A third part is called the Deuteronomist, which covers the book of Deuteronomy. It has a different style of writing than the other books, and it has a unique theology. It emphasizes the preaching on the law and purity in worship. And then the other source is called the priestly source, which covers especially the laws and how the people should worship. And it is theorized to come later. Well, this theory of JEDP is just a theory, and it tries to explain the differences that we find in the Pentateuch. It's not really that important for ministry, but you might come across this in your reading of different resources on the Pentateuch. Let's turn to the first part of the book of Genesis now, creation and flood. Introduction to the name and the book of Genesis. The name comes from the Septuagint Greek for source or beginning. It comes from the very first words of Genesis 1, in the beginning. The divisions of this book. There are two major sections to the book of Genesis. First is called the primeval history. That is the history before Abraham, chapters 1 through 11. And then the second part is the patriarchal history, chapters 12 through 50. This covers the period of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. There's a thematic division we can look at also to the Pentateuch. First of all is creation, chapters 1 and 2. And then the Garden of Eden and the fall, chapters 2 to 4. And then the patriarchs before the flood period, the patriarchs after the flood, Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph. We can also look at Genesis with a spiritual division. These words all rhyme in English. There is generation, which means birth. Degeneration is when something falls apart. We have the individual, Adam. We have the family under Cain. We have society falling apart under Noah. And then all the nations of the earth under Babel, the Tower of Babel. And then there's regeneration, where things are put back together with the covenant with Abraham. Another way to look at this is construction, things are made. Deconstruction, things are taken apart. And reconstruction, things are put back together again. Construction with creation, deconstruction with sin, and reconstruction with the covenant to Abraham. The major themes of Genesis. Genesis is a great epic of God's grace. We see the human problem and the need for a solution. God does not leave humanity alone, but offers a second chance. Genesis also gives the origin of Israel as a people. The purpose of Genesis. The people needed to be reminded of their roots. As the story of Genesis was written many centuries later, the people needed to be reminded that God would redeem them, that sin did not have the last say. It also shows Israel's place among the people of the world, that God had a special plan for this people, and through these people, God was going to reach the world. Turning then to the creation accounts. First of all, Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 4a. This is sometimes called the first creation account. It gives a broad overview of creation. The name for God used here is Elohim, the broad general term for God, the Almighty. We also get the story of the creation of Adam and Eve in God's image. Looking closer at this, if you want to turn in your Bible or study this later, you can look at it closer. Genesis begins, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. As we look at this, we can imagine that there was water. In the ancient view, the people believed that there was water above the earth because rain came down, and there was water under the earth because the springs pushed forth water from the ground. We see this in this understanding of the Spirit hovering over the face of the waters. We should not think that there was water at creation, but this is just the way the people thought in the ancient world. Because later on, God will create and separate the earth and the dirt and the oceans and waters. It is important to see that God is the creator, that God is revealed in Genesis 1 as the creator of heaven and earth, all that exists. God is the main actor in creation. There's no one else involved. God just simply says and things happen. There's 5 components to creation. The divine word, God said. God speaks forth creation simply by speaking. The announcement, let it be. When God speaks, things happen. The report, and it was so. The evaluation, and it was good. And then the temporal framework, morning and evening. God creates in 6 days, simply by speaking. The image of God is important also as we look through this story. Down in verse 26, God says, "Let us make man in our own image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." Theologians have wondered about what this image is, and they have come up with different ideas that how humanity is created in the image of God. One idea is called the natural image. This involves personality and selfhood, the ability to reflect, respond, having a conscience, the ability to choose. Theologians say that this part of the image was not lost at the fall of Adam and Eve when they sinned. In other words, we still are able to think, but sin does somehow affect our natural image. The theological image. This is the ability to respond in love to God. God has given humanity freedom to respond in love to Him. We are responsible for the choice of loving God or not loving God. The moral image. This is the ability to understand and do good. The ethical character, the ability to be holy. It is how we use the powers given to us for good or bad. Mankind was created holy, but chose to depart into sin. Thus the moral image was lost. Adam and Eve were holy, in close relationship with God through the Holy Spirit. Their nature, however, was corrupted and fallen when they ate of the forbidden fruit. They lost holiness and the positive influences of the Holy Spirit. Another way to understand this image of God is the spiritual image. We are different from animals. We are able to speak with God. We have a spirit. And then the functional image. We are God's representatives and administrators in creation. God put Adam and Eve in charge in the Garden of Eden. Let's look at Genesis chapter 2 now. A few more comments. From this first Genesis account, creation account, we see that life is not an accident but planned. God is personal and interested in the human condition. God made everything good. We see the unique position of the human in the image of God. The stewardship of creation, Adam and Eve were to take care of creation. And then Sabbath. On the 7th day, God rested after creating all things. Later on in the book of Exodus, we see that the people of Israel were brought out of Egypt and redeemed, and therefore they should also rest from their labors and rest on the 7th day. The Sabbath, later on, becomes a symbol of creation and of the relationship we should have with God. Genesis chapter 2 into Genesis chapter 3 shows the great test and the rise of sin. Sometimes this is described as a second creation account, or another way to look at it is simply a more specific look at what happened in Genesis chapter 1. It's like focusing in like a telescope. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil God placed in the middle of the garden. Why did God put this tree there? That's an interesting question to ask. I think in my own thinking and own conclusion that God put that tree there as a test to give Adam and Eve an opportunity to show their love. They would show that they loved God and believed in Him by obeying that one simple command. That's the only command that Adam and Eve had. They had complete freedom, except they should not eat of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But as we see as the story goes, Adam and Eve loved themselves more. They wanted to be like God, knowing good and evil. And so by eating of that tree of good and evil, they showed that they loved themselves more than God. We see that sin also has consequences. When they ate of that forbidden fruit, something happened within them. Genesis is not the only one that has a creation account. Other ancient texts have been discovered and stories from the ancient worlds, but these ancient Near Eastern myths of creation are much different, and they also help us understand something about the creation account also. Creation accounts tell us what people believe about God. For Israel, creation was historical and real. It was not mythical. This was something that actually happened in history. Creation is the beginning of the Exodus. It helps the people realize that God had a plan even from the beginning. For the ancient Near East, creation came from chaos and disorder, not from a plan, not from salvation. There's an ancient Babylonian myth that was discovered, and you see a picture of the actual tablets. This is known as the Enuma Elish, which means when on high, discovered in the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh in 669 to 633 BC. The creation in this story comes out of the conflict within nature. It's closely related to the agricultural festival. It shows some similarities with the Genesis account. There's a primeval state described as watery chaos. The basic order of creation is the same. The divine beings rest at the end of creation, and there's similar symbols and imagery. But it also shows some differences. The theology and worldview is much different. The concept of who the god or gods are is different. In the Babylonian account, there is chaos, when in the Genesis account, God is in full control. So Genesis shows that the people of Israel understood God and creation in a way much different than their neighbors. And this shows a lot about the theology of the Bible and how it was much different than the world around it. The theological implications of the Genesis creation account. First of all, God as creator. Creation is not an accident. We are not an accident of evolution. We are not created out of chaos, but we are created on purpose. We are created in God's image. But also the creation account, Genesis account, shows that sin is real and has consequences. There are implications to disobeying God. As we go on into Genesis chapter 4, we get the stories of that show and illustrate how sin becomes real and increases. The first story of Cain and Abel illustrates this. Abel was one who took care of animals, a shepherd, and Cain was the farmer. They brought sacrifices to God. Abel's was pleasing to God, but Cain's was not. Cain became jealous of his brother Abel and killed him, and because of that was cursed. Genesis chapter 5 shows the pre-flood genealogy of the people who lived. We see how they lived a long time. There's a common formula that's followed. Such and such lived how many years, gave birth to somebody else, and then the list of their years. The population grows. People take on new skill, but most significantly, sin increases during this time. Chapter 6 shows how people had come to the point of very much sinfulness. Social corruption explodes. God is ready to destroy the world and start over. This is a story of Noah and the flood. God is going to flood the earth and destroy it. There's one man, though, who is righteous, Noah, and God will save Noah and his family. The reason for the flood is given as the sin of humanity. God's answer is in two parts, and we see this pattern throughout the Bible. Sin is judged, but the righteous are saved. In the ancient Near East, there is an account called the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is very similar to the story of Noah and the flood. It has similarities like a hero who builds a boat, takes animals to preserve them, the entire population is destroyed, the waters dry up after the flood, the hero releases a bird, the ship finally rests on a mountain, the hero offers sacrifice, and the gods open the doors. This is a picture of that ancient account. It raises many questions for people, but it shows that there was an ancient flood. What is interesting is that the Babylonians interpreted this story in one way, and the Bible interprets it another way. Again, we see how theology is very significant. The theology of the Genesis account shows that God is judging sin, and God has a plan and will save the people. It's important as we think about this flood account to realize that God was not abandoning the human race, but in grace he was starting over. That righteousness will be saved, and that God would not abandon the human race, but would begin again with Noah and his family. In Genesis chapter 10 and 11, we get Noah's descendants. Chapter 9 describes the origin of the nations, how we have different races in different parts of the world. In chapters 10 and 11 are the rebellion of the nations. Chapter 11 is an illustration again of the problem of sin and the Tower of Babel. The ancient people wanted to build a tower to reach into heaven. This is a picture of an ancient ziggurat, it's called, ancient temple where people would build higher and higher. They wanted to get as close as they could to the gods, and it showed their power. The people in Genesis chapter 11 built a tower, something like this, and they wanted to reach to heaven, but God said no and confused their language. A summary of the key theological themes of this part of Genesis. Again, we see that God is creator, God is in control, God is sovereign. But we see also the problem of human sinfulness. Sin enters the world, and it's illustrated with many of the stories from Genesis chapter 4 through chapter 11. God will judge sin, but God also has sustaining grace, and he will hold up his plan and carry through with what he has planned.